Hello, everyone. This evening's topic is a little bit darker. A time filled with plagues, punishments, and food. We are delving into the actual conditions of medieval life. Put aside the chivalry and castles that Hollywood promised you. The truth is that you probably wouldn't make it a day. Therefore, before you settle in, please consider subscribing and liking the video, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. Seeing who is joining us from around the world is always fascinating. Now, turn down the lights and perhaps turn on a fan for that subtle background hum. And let's begin the journey together this evening slowly. You have just awoken in the year 1325, so congratulations. Good news, you're still alive. The fleas are also bad news. Because it was a barn floor 3 months ago, your bed is a straw mattress that is half rotted and stuffed with bugs and hay. Pillows, Egyptian cotton sheets, and memory foam are all absent. Just a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since the winter before and now weighs about as much as a small cow because of the grime that has built up. The distant church bell wakes you up as you blink awake. It's like an alarm clock from the Middle Ages, only louder and perhaps even crueler. Your house is a wooden hut with just one room, no windows, and a charming open floor plan in which your family, livestock, and domestic insects all live together. The scent, oh, it's like a fragrant orchestra. A subtle combination of stale beer, goat sweat, human sweat, and something you pray isn't mold, but probably is. Candles with scents have not yet been invented. Even if they were, your dirt floor would just melt them. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it because the air is freezing and your joints ache. You are 22 years old, which is about middle age in medieval terms. Your knees make the sound of a bag of rocks being shaken by a confused peasant, and your spine cracks like an old wooden door. The act of getting out of bed is risky. The floor is either crusty from something your neighbor's chicken did or wet from the rain that came through the thatched roof last night. Your bare feet are now a part of the ecosystem in either case. Also, privacy. What is this? You are waking up alongside your entire family, possibly including a random cousin who has never left. There is no private space, no curtains, and everything is shared. Welcome to the morning in medieval Europe, where parasites, rodents, and 8 other people are always with you and you are never truly alone. And this is how your day always begins. From here, it only gets worse. So, you've made it out of your horrible medieval haystack. Congrats. Nature now calls. Additionally, it is calling rudely. It is yelling. This is when you start to long for a modern bathroom. There is not even a slightly resentful plunger in the corner. And there is no toilet, seat, toilet paper, or flush. In the 14th century, self-depletion was a social experiment, an adventure, and frequently a small public event. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is probably a wooden bucket behind your house. It's already full because Uncle Wolfstan had a bad night because he ate bad turnips. Biblical is the smell. The shocking part comes after you take a deep breath and get on with your business. Throw it into the road. The street, yes. Before throwing it out the window, you should yell something like, "Garde à l'eau." That means watch out below in Old French. Despite the fact that, to be honest, nobody moves fast enough. In medieval towns, streets are open sewers that are a charming river of human waste, animal feces, and mysterious liquids you shouldn't look at. Congratulations if you are fortunate enough to live in a town with public restrooms. In an outhouse where privacy is a myth and ventilation is a cruel joke, you get to sit next to strangers. You might talk to each other, but try not to take in too much air. I've never heard of toilet paper. The majority of people use straw, leaves, rags, moss, or, if they're feeling particularly indulgent, wool. Nothing at all at times. This may help to explain why handshakes were initially unpopular. And surely it is better to be in a castle, right? Well, almost. You might wear a guard robe with a hole in the wall that leads directly into the moat at your waist. Great idea, except that your adversaries are aware of it. Yes, attackers occasionally entered through the waist chute. It's time to talk about getting in through the back door. Therefore, medieval toileting was a humiliating ritual for everyone, farmer or baron. It's cold, it's out in the open, it's risky, and it's always disgusting. If you slip on a wet stone path, you'll be face first in human remains. Additionally, you have not yet brushed your teeth, but we will get to that later. You got through the bathroom. A reward is due to you, right? Possibly a tasty breakfast. Something cozy, delectable, and reassuring. Sorry, this is medieval Europe. Here, nothing is reassuring. If you can call it that, breakfast is gloomy. Benedict, there are no eggs. Avocado toast and sputtering coffee makers are out of the question. To a wooden bowl of something that looks like it was scraped off a muddy boot, you squat or sit near the fire. Welcome to your daily pottage supply. Using whatever you can find, pottage is a thick, gooey stew. Root vegetables, grains, and, if you're lucky, maybe a few beans. It has been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes even weeks, and new ingredients are simply added on top of the ones that have been there for a while. It's more of an ongoing culinary experiment than a recipe. A piece of bread that was so hard it could stop arrows was on the side. Because wheat is a rich man's dream, it is made from coarse rye or barley flour that is frequently augmented with sawdust, ground acorns, or other inventive ingredients. Your friend is not this loaf. It is not sliced. You bargain with it. What about beverages? You are not having an oat milk latte or orange juice. You are having beer. Beer, yes, at 6 a.m. Why? Because the water is filthy and full of parasites. As a result, you start your day with a low-alcohol, high-survivability lager. It's also drunk by kids. Although nobody likes it, at least it won't kill you right away. Do you want cheese or meat? Keep on dreaming. That should only be done on saints' feast days and Sundays, and only if your Lord feels generous. The majority of peasants only consume meat a few times per year. Fresh fruit should only be consumed when in season and unfermented, and spices should not even be considered unless you are royalty. The price of a pinch of pepper is greater than your monthly salary. You try not to think about the rat that may have nibbled on your porridge in the night as you chew your coarse bread and sip your medieval beer because salt is valuable enough to be kept locked away. You are not energized by breakfast. It simply occurs to you. It's time to work like your life depends on it now that you're properly starving, because it absolutely does. Now that you've finished your miserable medieval breakfast, it's time to get dressed. Not that it will assist. There is only one item of clothing in your closet. One. You've been wearing this rough wool tunic or linen shift every day for months, if not years. Fashion cannot be categorized as seasonal. Wear this until it breaks down or infects you with a fungal infection. Optional undergarments if you're lucky, perhaps a linen tunic underneath. If you are not, you are going to be a commando under layers of wool that are scratchy and make you sweat. These layers were lovingly stitched together by someone who probably did not know what a seam was supposed to look like. Additionally, there is no soap, washing machine, or dry cleaner visible. As a result, your clothes have stains, are stiff, and smell like compost that has been marinated in a pigsty. They are difficult to wash even if you wanted to. You would need to haul water from a river or, well, heat it over a fire, scrub your tunic on a board covered in ashes or lie down, and hang it in the sun, which is out about 3 days per year. I'm not even getting started on shoes. If you have one, it has as much arch support as a banana peel and is made of untreated leather with barely any stitching. The majority of peasants simply walk barefoot through mud, dung, medieval landmines, also known as sharp rocks, and disease puddles. All of this has one meaning. You disgust your skin. You constantly itch. Bed bugs, fleas, and lice all live rent-free on your body. There are nobles, miserable monks, itchy children, and walking insect farms that everyone has. There is no escape. While chatting with the local priest, you'll use a wooden spoon to scratch your armpit. And nobody even blinks an eye. The rubbing has damaged your skin. A battlefield of bites on your scalp. And it would be a shame if you developed a rash. There is no hydrocortisone, no dermatologist, and no one to tell you that it is most likely scabies. You simply continue to suffer. And if you are fortunate enough not to contract an infection, excellent. That rash will simply stay with you for the next 6 months, acting like an unwanted sidekick from medieval times. It's time to get outside and start working yourself to death now that you're covered in misery and pain. It's time to show that morning smile now that you're completely covered in itches and damp wool. However, you do not, primarily due to the fact that in the Middle Ages, smiling was a risky game. Dentally, not emotionally. There is no floss, toothpaste, mouthwash, or toothbrush. The practice of oral hygiene is about as common as taking a bath, which is not very much. While some people may brush their teeth with wine or vinegar or chew on a twig, your teeth are mostly on their own and not doing well. Your smile will look like something out of a haunted crypt by the middle of your 20s. Cavities are everywhere. The gums are swelling. And these are not just stains from food on your teeth. This is decay. A medieval root cellar would have more decay in their mouth than you do. Sugar is becoming more prevalent among the wealthy, even though it is not yet widespread. Imported at a high cost, primarily used in small cakes or as a way to demonstrate wealth. I congratulate you if you are a noble. You can decay your teeth more quickly than the peasants. If you're poor, you'll do it slowly over time through hard chewing, fermented bread, and grainy porridge. Get accustomed to toothaches. They are always there, like the weather in medieval times. The kind of pain that makes you want to pray, drink, or use pliers to remove the tooth yourself. That is also not a joke. The actual treatment was that barber surgeons existed, but dentists did not. Yes. The same man who cuts your hair also takes out your MERS in the dark using an iron hook and no anesthetic. Tooth with infection. I trust you enjoy fevers, because if you don't take antibiotics, the toothache could easily turn into sepsis and kill you. That is correct. In the 13th century, your funeral might be the same thing that sends us to the pharmacy today. Additionally, there is no relief on the social front. Good luck with a kiss. Bad breath or halitosis is widespread. Your smile doesn't matter if you're single. Your livestock and land are what define you. In a nutshell, the battlefield is your mouth. Moreover, it is losing the war. Let's go outside now that your teeth are aching. Because your actual job, which will hurt your back, is just beginning. It's time to go to work. However, there is no opportunity for promotion, desk, or coffee break. If you're like 90% of people, your job is straightforward. Don't die working for someone else's well-being. You are a farmer. Congratulations. This indicates that you work the land that belongs to a lord who most likely does not remember your name. You get up with the sun and don't stop until it goes behind the trees. Your tools, a rusty sickle and a wooden hoe, as well as any bones that are still present in your body. Weekends do not exist. You cannot clock out. 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset is the only time. If you are not harvesting, fighting off raiders, or fervently praying for your infected toe to stop turning black, Sunday is off. The work is difficult. If you are wealthy enough, you can use oxen or hand to plow the fields. You carry water, plant seeds, pull weeds, and dig ditches until your spine starts to look like the letter S. If you're tired, nobody cares. Nobody inquires about your mental health. Surprise if you're a woman. You don't just work in the field. You also take care of kids. Cook, clean, feed the animals, spin wool, and act like your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly spreading to your side of the bed. Children, they begin volunteering around the age of 5. There was no school, no toys, and only a tiny wooden rake and the hope that one day they wouldn't get the flu. And if you're one of the few people who aren't a farmer, you should consider becoming a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper. In sheds with poor ventilation, you continue to work all day with fire, chemicals, or animal feces. The pay is primarily about survival. The benefits, occasional bleeding and breaking a bone, are terrible. Drink some warm beer, raise your temperature, and carry on. Even for a day, you can't afford to stop. because you won't eat if you don't work. Additionally, medieval Europe has a remedy for starvation. It is known as being replaced. As a result, you continue to dig despite the blisters by gripping your shovel. Because the Middle Ages did not consider work to be a career. It's a test of endurance in slow motion. Let's talk about the weather, since working in the fields has burned your back. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature was more about continuous punishment from the sky than about seasons. Let's begin with the winter. There is no weathering, no insulation, and no central heating. Merely wooden walls with cracks large enough to swallow a chicken. You have cloth covering your windows instead of glass. The fireplace's fire is nice in theory, but you don't have enough firewood because wood is expensive and sometimes illegal to gather from the forest. Yes, picking the wrong stick from the wrong forest can result in execution. Even though you huddle near the waning flames in your one damp wool tunic, you still wake up with your nose frozen. Your feet are always cold and often damp. Your fingers are so stiff that they feel like little popsicles from the past. There is no diagnosis for frostbite. It's just known as bad luck. Now, flash ahead to the summer. Sounds better, doesn't it? Wrong. Your house turns into a clay oven during the summer. There is no cross breeze, no fan, and no deodorant at all. You sweat through your layers, but you can't take them off because it's embarrassing, invites sunburn, insect bites, and social judgment, and showing too much skin. The smell of the goat stew from last week that is still fermenting in the corner attracts the flies, who are out in full force and attracted to your unwashed body. While you sleep, mosquitoes buzz by your ears, assuming you can sleep through the yelling and crying of your neighbor's children. You get burned by the sun in the fields. You couldn't wear a hat or sunscreen unless you made one out of straw like a desperate scarecrow. The worst part is that you have to continue working. Simply put, heat stroke is known as taking a bad turn. So, you're either shivering in your own home and wondering if your toes will make it through the winter, or you're sweating through your lone pair of socks while your thighs itch to death. The one thing that never changes, regardless of the season, is that your clothes still itch, your food still tastes awful, and your next job still isn't available. Welcome to medieval-style climate control. There isn't any. Do you feel thirsty? Do you need to refresh? Do you want to get out of this wet fever dream of a life by splashing some water on your face? It's a pity. In the Middle Ages, water was not a friend. It is quietly trying to kill you. Let's begin by drinking. The nearby stream appears to be clean, fresh, and bubbling, like something from a fantasy film. However, disclaimer, it is not. A chamber pot was just dumped into it upstream. If that isn't the case, then it most likely contains the remains of a dead pig. Every sip contains parasites, bacteria, and the entire medieval European microbial army. Beer was consumed as a result of this. Yes, beer, children included. However, it's important to remember that medieval beer was small, low in alcohol, and strong for survival before you imagine kids doing keg stands. The water was safer than anything that passed through the town ditch because it was boiled during brewing. If you were wealthy enough to be able to afford it and didn't care about functioning properly before noon, wine was another option. How about taking a bath? Water was undoubtedly used for cleaning. Yes, theoretically. In the real world, absolutely not. Back then, people were of the opinion that taking a bath actually made your pores larger, allowing the disease to enter. That is correct. Self-washing was thought to pose a health risk. It would appear that you were cleaner if you never removed the skin-protective layer of dirt. Although communal bathhouses did exist, they quickly earned the reputation of being hotbeds of rumor, scandal, and even full-blown medieval extracurricular activities. As a result, the church naturally intervened and closed many businesses. It was a full production even if you wanted to bathe. You would need to get water from the well, boil it over a fire, put it in a leaky wooden tub, and pray that no one else in the house used it before or after you. Additionally, rainwater was collected in open barrels where moss, insects, and birds poop. Doesn't that sound rejuvenating? Therefore, water in the Middle Ages was less of a source of life and more of a risk, whether it was ingested, applied to one's body, or applied to one's crops. If you take the wrong sip, you'll be sweating profusely in a straw bed, clutching your stomach, and debating all of your options for the rest of your life. Make a toast to our forefathers the next time you drink tap water. You drank the water because they didn't have the luxury of staying hydrated without risk. Or perhaps you didn't. It's possible that you just stubbed your toe on a disappointment-shaped rock. Regardless, you are ill. You require aid. You must see a doctor. It's a shame that you live in the Middle Ages, when medical education was merely polite torture for those with a theology degree. First things first, the diagnosis. Your humors are out of balance, which is the root cause of everything wrong with you, including the creeping plague, broken bones, a cough, and a rash. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were the four humors. Medieval science held that maintaining a healthy balance between them, like an internal soup, was essential to good health. Have a fever? A lot of blood? The response? Bloodletting. That is correct. Let's use a dull blade or a hungry leech to drain your life force into a bowl. Yes, it was frequently done by barbers. Imagine getting a haircut and a blood test done all at once. Baby, 2 for 1. Being depressed or anxious. Clearly, there is too much black bile there. The remedy? Laxatives. Perhaps a warm herbal purge or just prayers and a cold compress while everyone starts carving your coffin and doesn't look at you. Now, you're in serious trouble if you break a bone or get a nasty wound. Except for the possibility of passing out from pain, there is no anesthesia. Knives used in surgery have not been cleaned since the Crusades. The reason tools are heated over fire is not for sterilization, but rather because it makes them look more terrifying. Antibiotics hundreds of years away. There is no germ theory yet. They believe that bad air or God's annoyance over your moral failings cause disease. Have an upset stomach? It had to have been your evil thoughts. I hope you enjoy admitting while vomiting. More leeches, possibly some crushed beetles, and a priest at your bedside giving you last rites in case your condition gets worse will be used to treat you. They are getting ready for the treatment known as death at this point. And if you recover miraculously, everyone just assumes that God felt sorry for you. The leech gets promoted while the doctor gets all the credit. So, yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine was more about surviving the cure than healing. It's finally time to eat after a long day of labor, lice, and leeches. You return to your home with a growling stomach, ready for the one thing that makes life worth living: a warm meal. The bad news, it's likely that your meal is trying to kill you. Let's start with the fundamentals. Preserving food is not really possible. Salt, smoke, and the hope that the cold winter air keeps things fresh are all there. There is no fridge or freezer. If you are fortunate enough to have any meat, it has been marinated in questionable brine, covered in flies, hanging out for days, and possibly shared with a few rats. The medieval diet relies heavily on bread. However, even that isn't secure. Bark, sawdust, or even clay are used to make it stretch in bad harvest years by desperate peasants. Additionally, there is a bonus if it is rye season. A fungus known as ergot can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and even death, similar to eating bread laced with tetanus and LSD. Only vegetables that are in season. And what's always in season, turnips, numerous turnips, boiled, mashed, or floating in pottage, which, if you remember from Chapter 3, is essentially a hot swamp of mysterious ingredients that has been simmering since the funeral of your great-grandfather. Even though fruit is available in the fall, it quickly rots, and the wealthy hoard sugar to show off their stained teeth. Dairy is yet another bet. Milk that is fresh spoils quickly. Cheese and butter perform better, but they contain a lot of bacteria. Since it's either that or chewing your boodle leather, people eat them anyway. Let's also talk about the seasoning. Pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg are examples of spices, more valuable than gold. For the typical peasant, flavor comes from pain, onions, and, if lucky, salt. The majority of meals taste like damp, sad burlap. But food isn't just bad for your health. It has to do with politics. If you are caught poaching a rabbit, you risk being fined, imprisoned, or even executed. The Lord owns game animals, not you. That is correct. You might end up dead from your dinner. Remember that every bite is a risk as you eat your gray stew under the flickering firelight. But you still eat. Because food did not nourish people in the Middle Ages. Challenges you. It is now evening. You have labored, endured hardship, and have barely absorbed your suspicious stew. Even though you may believe that the day is coming to an end, God is watching. The priest is also like this, as is Agnes, your neighbor, who will absolutely scold you if you miss Mass. Religion was more than just a part of daily life in medieval Europe. This is life. Your calendar, laws, education, birth, marriage, death, and everything in between are all under the control of the church. Could be considered your spiritual landlord. Additionally, you always fall behind on rent. Prayer bells are at the center of every day's schedule. In the morning, at noon, and at night, the town church bell rings. The absence of prayer is a sin, not because people require reminders. Neglect to bow. Sin. Friday is meat day. Sin. Double sin. Think about your neighbor's wife in that one dream. Additionally, hell does exist. Incredibly real. Priests go into great detail about it. Demons wielding pitchforks, lakes of boiling blood, rivers of fire, and endless wailing. If the idea of eternal damnation scares you, the plague will. The Bible is written in Latin, a language reserved for monks, clergy, and that one noble kid who is too good for dirt. As a result, you can't read it yourself. Everything will be interpreted for you by the church. This indicates that if the priest claims that your crop failure was caused by your lack of prayer, it is time to kneel even harder. Tithes are required, equal to 10% of everything you own. Wheat is what you get from growing it. Eggs are produced when chickens are raised. Congratulations if you have nothing at all. You are doomed financially and spiritually. Holidays are considered holy days, numerous of them. Even though they provide breaks from work, they are not fun. As a result, it's risky to go to Mass, fast, confess your sins, and remind yourself that joy is a sin. Skeptics are quickly converted. Heretics are burned, witches are drowned, blasphemers are flogged, and questioning the church is dangerous. As a result, you follow the routine. You sing. You kowtow. If the priest likes you, you pray that your soul will finally arrive in paradise after living this filthy life. Because God might be kind in the Middle Ages. However, not so much the church. Try it as a woman if you thought being a medieval peasant was hard. All the filth, hunger, and fear, plus childbirth, servitude, and social invisibility. Being a woman in the Middle Ages was like being stuck in hard mode without any health supplements or a restart button. A girl's life path is pretty much set from birth. Marry young, have kids, serve your husband, and die exhausted. Education is unlikely. Unless you come from a noble family and are sent to a convent, you don't develop intellectually until you can make butter and sew a tunic. Early marriage takes place. Incredibly early. Being engaged at 12 and pregnant at 14 is not unusual. There is no love involved. Land, livestock, and alliances are the focus. Your opinion is not necessary. You become essentially your husband's property once you get married. Produce heir, feed everyone, operate the house, and refrain from complaining are your responsibilities. Because if you complain, you might be called a nag or, even worse, a witch. Depending on local fashion, that label comes with a complimentary drowning or burning. Birthing a child is a death lottery. There is no sterile equipment, no prenatal care, and no anesthesia. Even minor complications can result in the death of the mother, the child, or both, despite the best efforts of midwives. Some women have more than 10 children. Additionally, many die. However, don't worry. Your work will increase once the baby is born. You are now expected to nurse, cook, clean, and still assist in the fields despite having a screaming infant in a hut with lice. You are not granted a break. You provide everyone else with a break. You are suspicious if you are single, vulnerable if you are widowed, dangerous if you're outspoken. Women who didn't fit in were often accused of witchcraft, especially if they knew a lot about herbs, had a big personality, or just thought someone was funny on a rainy Tuesday. Your role is limited even in the church. The rules of life for nuns were very strict. You can't speak or move freely without permission, and neither can your spiritual worth. Always placed lower than men. In a nutshell, if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, it was expected of you to suffer, obey, reproduce, and endure in silence, ideally with a grin on your face. Because women were somehow expected to endure pain with grace even during a time of universal suffering. You have endured filth, hunger, social injustice, and possibly a goat thus far. However, just when you think things can't get any worse, violence strikes. By medieval standards, loud, bloody, and frequently completely acceptable. Let's be clear, things were not peaceful in the Middle Ages. Most of the time, law and order meant hoping the local lord wasn't down. There is violence everywhere. Crime is common, punishment is harsh, and justice is more performance art than protection. In the home, on the streets, on the battlefield, in church disputes, and sometimes in line at the communal bread oven. If you steal a loaf of bread, you run the risk of losing a hand. If you are accused of lying, you run the risk of having your tongue pierced. If you gossip too much, you run the risk of meeting the scold's bride, who will put a bar in your mouth and a metal mask on your head, of course, for correction. Let's say you've been accused of a serious crime. Theft, witchcraft, and heresy. How can you establish your innocence? Clearly, by being tortured. Welcome to the ordeal of a trial. In one version, to retrieve a stone, you place your hand in boiling water. You are innocent if it heals without infection in 3 days. If not, you are responsible. You could also be thrown into a river. You are innocent and probably dead if you sink. You are liable and will receive punishment regardless if you float. Similar to a medieval game show where survival is the prize and the host actively supports your opponents. Additionally, the event of your death sentence is public. Hangings, beheadings, and burnings are all performed in front of cheering crowds. Snacks are often brought by individuals. It's like cable TV in the Middle Ages. Domestic violence is perfectly acceptable. Discipline of wives and children was permitted and even expected of husbands. Street fights are common. Just for looking the wrong way at a noble's horse, you could be beaten. Likewise, the simmering conflict, religious crusades, territorial disputes, and local feuds in the name of honor, God, or boredom. Someone is always marching off to stab another person. In the Middle Ages, violence was not associated with social breakdown. Society is to blame. Every person lives with the constant awareness that life is fragile, that justice is arbitrary, and that your neighbor might hit you in the head with a pig. As a result, walk with caution, keep your head down, and never give a stranger a club. You've made it through the lice, leeches, laundryless misery, and looming public disengagement at this point. However, the majority of medieval lives now come to an end with a quick and unassuming death. You are practically a celebrity if you are still alive after the age of 40. You might even be called the Old One, which is more of a statistical miracle than a nickname. Let's dissect it. The infant mortality rate significantly reduces the average life expectancy, which is between 30 and 40 years. About half of all children died before they were 5 years old. All it took was one bad winter, malnutrition, or disease. There is no hope, no antibiotics or vaccines. If you made it through childhood, you were already tired when you got to adulthood. When you were 25 years old, your joints creaked like a monastery door, and work began as soon as you were able to stand up. It's possible that you are missing a finger, several teeth, and the majority of your initial optimism. Childbirth presented a particularly dangerous challenge for women. In the Middle Ages, it was one of the leading causes of death for women. Praying, drinking hot water, and having someone hold your hand as you bled out on a straw-filled cot provided no pain relief or medical assistance. The dangers for men were different, but they were just as relentless. Accidents on farms, infections from minor wounds, a neighbor's drunken rage, and a failed crusade. Even going to the market on foot could be dangerous if you meet a bored bandit or an irate tax collector. Famine, which can last for entire seasons and decimate entire villages, or the plague, which transformed cities into cemeteries overnight, could also quietly result in death, or from bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and waking up hallucinating and screaming at the walls in your final hours. Funerals, on the other hand, were rare. To prevent disease, bodies were frequently buried quickly. If there was enough space in the churchyard, there would be no embalming, no polished coffins, just a hole, a few murmured prayers, and a shallow earthen mound. Therefore, it is true that life in the Middle Ages was brutal, brief, and constantly beset by death in all of its various forms. You were not retired. You stopped showing up recently. Let's move on to your final chapter in light of exits. The medieval fantasy is over. So, how are you doing today? You've woken up in filth, peed in a bucket, brushed your teeth with wishful thinking, been nearly starving, worked until your spine cried out for mercy, scratched your way through itchy wool, prayed that you wouldn't get plague, and barely escaped a public execution for owning a squirrel. A single day in medieval Europe is here. Do you still long to be a knight? Try again. That idealized version of the Middle Ages, complete with brave swordsmen, opulent ladies in towers, and heroic battles and feasts in grand halls illuminated by candles. It is a myth that has been refined by fantasy and fairy tale novels. The medieval world was actually rough, cruel, and extremely unfair. Everything was about hierarchy. You'd always be poor if you were born that way. Thank you for being born wealthy. You were more likely to survive. However, descent and a hasty burial were still one bad soup away. Misfortune struck even the nobles. Fleas, smoke, and politically motivated marriages filled castles, which were cold stone refrigerators. You had a goblet of wine and a fur cloak, but you also had a 50% chance of dying in a skirmish or from an infected splinter. The simpler times weren't easy, so they weren't exactly a luxury. They were obstinate. Things took longer overall. Everything was more painful. There were consequences for everything, from having children to chewing. Life was about survival, not fun. And if you did manage to find a quiet time to contemplate, fantasize, and envision something better, you couldn't really do much with it. There is no modern medicine, no upward mobility, and no internet to Google. What is this strange rash? Within a 10-mile radius of your birthplace, you suffered, worked, and died. But the wildest part is here. People continue to laugh, sing, tell stories, fall in love, and discover meaning in the midst of all of this. It's not because life was easy. Rather, humans are just stubborn. They made room for light even in the darkest chapters. Therefore, as you settle into your clean bed tonight with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and central heating, perhaps you should quietly express your gratitude to the modern world as well as to your ancestors, who fought against rats, famine, and feudalism so that you wouldn't have to. She was just Sophie long before she became Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia as a whole, the mistress of reform, and an icon of ambition. In 1729, she was born Sophie Federica Augusta von Anhälterst. She was the daughter of a German princely family that was not very well known. In terms of power, her tiny dush in Pomerania offered little. However, Sophie herself, she had a quality that no title could describe. A quiet, unquenchable thirst for greatness, relentless charm, and razor-sharp intelligence. She was raised in a strict home. Johanna was a social climber who was obsessed with status, not a warm, nurturing figure. She was cold and calculated. Prussian officer Sophie's father was more distant than disciplinarian. Sophie was taught to balance obedience with deceit from an early age. She read extensively, spoke multiple languages, and acquired the ability to observe a room before speaking in it, skills that would soon serve as tools for survival in one of Europe's harshest courts. When the Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna started looking for a wife for Grand Duke Peter, her heir, she looked outside of Russia. Empress Elizabeth believed that a pliable and grateful foreign bride would be easier to control, as Peter was of German descent. Sophie was the ideal candidate, a reputation for grace and humility, Lutheran faith, which she would have to abandon, and noble blood. Sophie was taken to Russia when she was just 14 years old. She arrived in St. Petersburg, the icy capital. Petersburg in 1744, dressed in thin German clothing and smiling diplomatically. Like a chess piece, her mother pushed her forward. However, Sophie had a different strategy in mind. She converted to Orthodoxy and adopted the name Ekaterina Alexa, Catherine, in order to gain acceptance in Russian society. The ceremony was life-altering, public, and symbolic. She was not simply switching religions. She was stepping into a foreign empire without a way out and was burning the bridge behind her. Betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire were all on the horizon for that quiet teenage girl in a fur-trimmed coat. But as soon as Sophie entered the Russian court, she stopped being a pornographer and started making plans for how to become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was intended to ensure her status as a member of Russian royalty. However, it was more like a cage than a crown from the beginning. Peter, the Russian throne's heir, was not the handsome prince of legend. He was awkward, immature, and obsessed with toy soldiers. In his chambers, he was more interested in playing war games than he was in running an empire or loving his new wife. According to some accounts, he may even have held off on getting married for years. He resented the Russian court that had adopted him and idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia. Catherine, on the other hand, embraced Russia with unwavering determination. She memorized Orthodox rituals, studied the language's history, and learned its history. She craved belonging. Peter desired to flee. It wasn't just an emotional mismatch. It involved politics. The gossip, paranoia, and brutal power games of the Russian court were like a viper's nest. Despite her declining health, Empress Elizabeth maintained her absolute power. Everyone had a plan and was aware that a change was coming. Catherine was constantly watched. Every move she made, her friendships and letters were scrutinized. She had no faith in her husband, her mother, who was still whispering in her ear for foreign interests, or even her maids. Alliances can quickly become accusations in this world. However, Catherine wasn't a fool. She learned to play the games of the court in the shadows and cultivate allies. In stark contrast to her husband's childish tantrums and open contempt for Russian traditions, she charmed military officers, made friends with scholars, and developed a reputation for dignity and restraint. Catherine began reading Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu behind closed doors. She was building a vision, not just for herself but also for Russia, of a nation of strength, education, and reason, even though others saw her as a young consort. However, there was one issue. Catherine remained powerless as a wife to a man unfit to rule the longer Peter lived. So she waited, observed, and planned. She was aware that no one would inherit the Russian throne. It needed to be taken. After nearly 2 decades of quietly maneuvering, waiting, and watching, Catherine finally recognized her opportunity in 1762 and seized it with astonishing precision. After Empress Elizabeth's death, Peter, now known as Peter III, became Tsar. However, his reign almost immediately began to unravel. Peter alienated the church, offended the nobility, insulted the army, and praised Prussia, Russia's longtime adversary, in just a few short months. He changed important policies, made the clergy feel bad, and said that he would divorce Catherine to marry his mistress. The court became stoic, already wary of his unpredictable behavior. In the corridors, the army, led by generals who supported Catherine, moaned. Even ordinary, patriotic Russians saw Peter as a foreign puppet mocking their customs. Catherine made her move as she watched everything happen. A coup d'etat without blood was launched in July of the same year by Catherine while Peter was away at his summer palace. She rode through St. Louis with the help of important military officers, including her lover Gregory Olaf and his influential brothers. Petersburg was crowned Empress Catherine II in full regalia and gained the support of the powerful imperial guard. Peter was taken by surprise, and without any allies, he gave up within days. He was taken into custody, and shortly thereafter, mysterious circumstances led to his death. It was officially described as a hemorrhoidal colic. It was officially considered murder. Empress was now Catherine, by will, wit, and bravery, not by marriage or birth. It was unheard of. Without fighting a single battle, a foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim to the Russian throne ascended. However, the real obstacle she faced was just beginning. She had to make that daring attempt to gain power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia grant her asylum? Would the nobles honor her? Could she maintain control of the empire without succumbing to the same fate as her husband? Catherine was aware that power acquired through manipulation could also be lost. She needed to rule as a visionary rather than a schemer. As a result, she began to evolve from a cautious conspirator into a reforming empress, one who would redefine what it meant to be a woman in power, embrace the Enlightenment, and redraw borders. Catherine could have relied on her power once she had the crown. She didn't, though. She wasn't just interested in sitting on a throne. She wanted to do something more. She desired to change Russia, intellectually, not only militarily but also politically. Catherine adored Voltaire Diderot and the daring thinkers of the Enlightenment, whereas Peter adored Frederick the Great and toy soldiers. Even though she held absolute power, she believed in reason, progress, education, and the monarch's duty to serve the people. Catherine read more than just philosophy from the Enlightenment. She was there. For more than 15 years, she wrote to Voltaire directly, praising him and defending her autocracy. To help Diderot out financially, she even bought his entire library and invited him to her court. She pored over legal documents, debated reforms, and crafted policies to modernize the empire behind closed doors. Early efforts to codify Russian law dominated her reign. In 1767, she established the Legislative Commission, an ambitious endeavor with the goal of revising Russia's entire legal code. A disguised political manifesto, Catherine's own nakazes or instruction talked about equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the duty of rulers to serve the common good. It was radical for an empress in Russia in the 18th century. However, Enlightenment ideals had to adapt to the realities of Russia, a vast, feudal, and deeply conservative country governed by nobles who preferred their serfs to be located directly beneath them. Catherine was aware of this. She moved carefully as she advocated for change. She built schools and libraries, expanded access to secular education, and outlawed some forms of torture. However, she also reaffirmed the nobility's authority over their serfs in order to maintain their loyalty. Catherine had to balance this. A public philosopher queen and a private practical empress. She had to choose between survival and ideology, between Paris's glittering salons and Moscow's gritty politics. She had a bold but always calculated vision for Russia. Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia more European in many ways. She was attempting to modernize Russia on her terms. Yes, reform was required, but only with a velvet-gloved iron hand. Catherine was not content with internal reforming Russia. She wanted to spread it out so that it could be feared, admired, and envied. Catherine set out to tear down the walls where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west. Russia's borders expanded more than ever before under her leadership. She went to war not only to protect her crown, but also to change the way Europe was laid out. Her war against the Ottoman Empire was one of her most important campaigns. It wasn't just about territory that these wars, which were fought in waves over the 1760s and 1770s, were about. They dealt with influence. Catherine viewed herself as the legitimate defender of Eastern Europe and the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule. Under the leadership of generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Pumpkin, Russia gained control of important areas like Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and access to warm water ports, which the Russian czars had long desired. These victories were symbolic as well as military. Catherine communicated with each victory. Russia was no longer Europe's distant and backward cousin. A continental force it was. She also shifted her focus to the west. Catherine participated in the partitions of Poland through a series of deals and diplomatic maneuvers. Along with Austria and Prussia, she split up the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland was removed from the map by the end of the Third Partition in 1795, and Russia claimed millions of new subjects and vast new lands. However, Catherine didn't just use armies to conquer. She also brought ideas to the colony. New cities were constructed. Trade routes were made more open. Russian farmland was opened up to German settlers. From the icy Baltic to the sand-drenched Black Sea, the empire became a mosaic. In addition, Catherine remained the driving force throughout the entire process, reading reports, issuing directives, and personally directing the development of her expanding empire. She would be criticized for being imperialist and power-hungry. However, expansion was not Catherine's goal. It just happened. She believed that borders, not just ideas, were what measured a great ruler. She wanted more than just to lead Russia. She wanted to rebuild it into a civilized empire that would be loyal to her alone, respected by its peers, and feared by its adversaries. Catherine the Great was just as well known for what transpired behind closed palace doors as for her brilliance and power. And no, it wasn't all whispered in libraries. One of the most talked about aspects of Catherine's reign was her private life. She had many lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully selected parade of younger men, often handsome and influential in politics, who were many decades older than her. She did not conceal them. In point of fact, she frequently rewarded them for good behavior with titles, estates, and pensions. If that wasn't enough, they were quietly let go, sometimes with a cordial thank you and a promotion. Gregory Pumpkin, a bold and brilliant individual, was one of these lovers' most important. The lines between romance, politics, and partnership were blurred by their relationship. Some historians speculate that they may have even secretly wed. They had a significant impact on military operations, projects of colonization, and the transformation of southern Russia. Pumpkin was more than just a friend. In many ways, he was a co-ruler with her. Nevertheless, Europe was unable to ignore the scandal. There was gossip. She was depicted as lustful, insatiable, and even irrational in satirical publications. Furthermore, the rumors only intensified after her passing. The most well-known is the completely erroneous and horrifying story about a horse that was spread by her adversaries to discredit her legacy. But what's the fuss about? Simple. Catherine was a woman who was unreserved in her use of power. She also refused to play the role in a world where female rulers were expected to be saintly virgins or tragic figures. She was dangerous because she lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms. Ironically, Catherine was deeply philosophical about love and sexuality, even though her critics portrayed her as immoral. She was of the opinion that pleasure was a normal part of life and that personal relationships did not have to jeopardize public duty. Rarely do male rulers manage to separate governance from emotion. In point of fact, her liaison was frequently calculated. She surrounded herself with men who were trustworthy, skilled, and useful in politics. She let them go when they stopped being a part of her, usually with a wry grin and a generous retirement. Catherine's love life did not diminish her authority. She used it as part of her plan, a unique combination of passion and power that was admired and feared alike. Catherine's reign was not without risk. despite her charisma and authority. In addition, a bearded Cossack by the name of Ilan Pugachev posed that threat in 1773. He was not your typical rebel. Pugachev claimed to be Catherine's deceased husband, Peter III. He claimed that he had survived the coup and was now returning to oust the German usurper from the throne. It was ridiculous. Peter had long since left. The assertion, on the other hand, did not have to be true for Russia's oppressed and drained lower classes. It only needed to give people hope. Lower taxes, land for the common people, and the end of serfdom were among the promises made by Pugachev. The Volga River region, particularly among Sacs peasants and seasoned believers, was ignited by his words. His promises sounded like salvation at a time when the gap between nobles and serfs had sharply increased. The largest peasant uprising in Russian history was the Pugachev Rebellion. Fortresses fell, towns were taken, and nobles were killed. It appeared, for a terrifying moment, as though the empire might fall apart on its own. Catherine broke down. She could not win a foreign war with cavalry and treaties. This was a revolt against the system led by her own people. She presided, but Catherine did not get scared. She performed. She sent professional military forces to brutally crush the rebellion. In 1774, Pugachev's forces were defeated. As a public warning to those who dared to follow, he was captured, displayed in an iron cage, and eventually beheaded in Moscow. Catherine then increased her emphasis on control and order. She became silent as her dreams of quietly liberating the waves vanished. She had learned through the rebellion the limits of enlightenment in a nation still bound by feudalism. She was now more reliant on the nobility, who were willing to serve her in return for complete command of their serfs. A turning point occurred here. The empress who once referred to Voltaire as her hero now put stability ahead of philosophy. Reform became circumspect. The amount of surveillance grew. Even whispered rebellion was to be crushed before it had time to breathe. Catherine was haunted by the warning that Pugachev left behind despite the fact that he had lost his head. Before the storm blew through, that power based on inequality could only last so long. Catherine the Great had ruled Russia longer than any other female ruler in Russian history by the time she was approaching her final years. She had redefined what it meant to be a monarchy woman and defied expectations from the moment she took power. Russia became a true European powerhouse under Catherine's rule. It absorbed Crimea, portions of Poland, and portions of the Black Sea coast as its territory expanded by more than 200,000 square miles. These weren't just wins from the military. They reshaped trade, secured warm water ports, and were strategic pivots. However, her legacy was not limited to maps alone. Catherine also had an impact on culture. She contributed to the establishment of the Hermitage Museum, accumulated one of Europe's finest art collections, and corresponded with the greatest Enlightenment thinkers. Her court became a hub of art, intellectual ambition, and sophistication. Catherine put Russia firmly on the cultural map in a nation that Western Europeans frequently consider to be backward. She modernized education by establishing schools for girls and advocating for book printing. He made smallpox vaccination available to Russia and even received the vaccine in public, which was considered a brave scientific move at the time. However, there were also contradictions in her reign. She never broke free of the waves, despite her admiration for Enlightenment ideals. She actually went further into Russia's territories with her serfdom. Even though her reforms were impressive, they mostly came from the top and were meant to polish the empire without really changing its foundations. Nonetheless, stability and ambition were brought about by Catherine's rule. She was aware that power did not come from birth. It was made, controlled, and constantly protected. She ruled not through divine right but through willpower, political savvy, and unrelenting calculation. She was referred to as a user, tyrant, reformer, and seductress, among other things. But her effectiveness was most important. Russia was wealthier, larger, and more formidable than it had been in centuries when she died in 1796. She left behind a legend that would last for centuries, an expanded empire, and a secure throne. Catherine did more than just rule. She ruled with strategy, intelligence, and a firm grip on history. She became more than just an empress as a result. She became legend. Catherine the Great was, at her core, a woman navigating a man's world and reshaping it in her image, despite her power, expansion, and lasting legacy. Someone who was acutely aware of her precarious position was concealed behind the state decrees and portraits of the imperial family. She was not Russian by birth. A coup brought her to the throne. She was in charge of an empire that didn't want a woman in power. Yet she not only survived but also thrived. Catherine never satisfied herself with being decorative. She never stopped learning and wrote endlessly while reading and writing. She had a busy schedule every day, reading reports for hours, communicating with foreign powers, editing state papers, and managing a court with many different factions. She wanted to do more than just sit on the throne. She used the throne like a ruler who was made for it. In many ways, she was also alone. She wrote in her memoirs about how few people she could truly trust, despite the fact that she was surrounded by courtiers, lovers, and artists. Her son Paul, whom she feared would undo all of her progress and kept out of state affairs, became a man. Her most profound emotional partnership, Gregory Pimkin, turned into a close friendship, but his death in 1791 left a scar that never fully healed. Catherine carefully crafted her image. She was more adept than most monarchs of her time at using narrative's power. She posed as Russia's mother, enlightened king, warrior, empress, and art lover. But beneath those roles was a woman who had persevered despite being betrayed, humiliated, scandalized, and rebellious. When she passed away in 1796, she left behind a changed empire and questions. Could she have done more to end the sexual abuse? Was politics a hindrance to the Enlightenment ideals she held dear? Did she prefer to rule over reform? She is remembered in history as the Great, a title she never used. She was not perfect, kind, or just because of it. In a time and place where women weren't supposed to have any power, she took it and used it in her own way. She wore more than just the crown. What it meant to merit one was rewritten by her. The Palenque ruins, located in the humid jungle of Chiapas in southern Mexico, tell tales from the ancient Maya world. The limestone faces of the towering temples rise above the canopy, their secrets still aplenty despite being worn away by time. Additionally, in 1994, one of those secrets came to light. Fanny Lopez Jimenez was leading a group of Mexican archaeologists as they looked over Temple 3, a relatively small pyramid next to the more well-known Temple of the Inscriptions, where the powerful King Piel the Great was buried. They didn't think the throne of the temple would hold much until they noticed something strange. A hidden, sealed room beneath the structure. It had been untouched by looters. It was spotless. A stone sarcophagus was silently resting when the archaeologists broke through and lowered themselves inside. The weight of centuries was heavy in the air. Bright, shocking red dust rose like smoke as they opened the lid. Powdered cinnabar, a harmful mercury sulfide that the mirror used for ceremonial purposes, covered the interior. A woman's skeleton was also concealed within that crimson cloud. She had been laid to rest with respect and care. Her skull was still covered in a jade mask, and her body was surrounded by jewelry made of jade and shell, including ear spools, necklaces, and diadems. Her bones were fragile but still intact. The burial exuded royalty in every way. However, no name was written in. She was not named by any glyphs. One of the most lavish female burials ever discovered in Mesoamerica. Yet it remained a complete mystery. Why was she covered in red dust? Who was she? She was probably a queen, a priestess, or even Pal's wife. She was referred to as the Red Queen by the researchers, and the name stuck. But even with modern forensics, They were unable to identify her beyond the fact that she had lived around the 7th century during Palank's golden age. Her tomb had been deliberately isolated and hidden, in contrast to the majority of Mayer tombs. Her burial was more than just religious. It was religious. Words were not meant to be used to remember this woman. Ritual, color, and the mystery she left behind were all meant to be used to remember her. The silence of the sealed chamber and the Red Queen's jade jewelry were not the tomb's most haunting features. Red dust was the culprit. Everything was covered in a thick layer of powdered cinnabar. The walls, her sarcophagus, her bones, and even the offerings all around her, it clung to the stone like blood. This was no accident, according to the mayor. Cinnabar, made from crushed mercury sulfide, was one of the ancient world's most sacred and dangerous substances. In addition to being eye-catching, it had a fiery red color. Blood, rebirth, and the life force that linked the human and divine realms were all represented by it. Red was holy. It was the hue of dawn, death, and life emerging from death. It was also more than just symbolic. It was religious. The practice of covering the deceased in cinnabar was intended to transform the body and preserve it for transition rather than eternity. The Maya thought that death was not the end. It was a crossing into a new cosmic layer, a passage. Therefore, the Red Queen, whoever she was being prepared for deification as well as burial. However, there is a further layer to this. Cinnabar is harmful. Mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, and even death can result from repeated exposure. Although they probably did not comprehend the chemistry, the mayor felt its potency. It was dangerous, powerful, and volatile. It was a sign that this person was not just another mortal to bathe in it. Very few people in Palank were buried with cinnabar. One of them was Pal, the powerful king whose pyramid dominates the site. The red powder covered both his and her bodies. Even that small detail sparked speculation. Was the Red Queen his mother, wife, or someone with the same divine status as him? Another sacred symbol, jaguar skin, had been used to cover her skull. Bone needles, obsidian blades, and tiny jade figurines all around her pointed to rituals that had been performed either in her honor or during her lifetime. She was buried in a way that told a story without words. A dark tale of power and intrigue. A woman drenched in the color of sacrifice was getting ready to cross into the afterlife, not in silence but in formality. A world of silence, only broken by the gleam of jade, shell, and obsidian, surrounded the Red Queen's blood-stained remains. These weren't just pretty things. They were offerings, each carefully selected to accompany her on her way to the Sabalba, the Maya afterlife. Her cold, heavy jade necklaces had polished surfaces that, after 300 years underground, were still shining brightly. Jade was more than just pretty. It was important. It was regarded as a sign of eternal life by the Maya. It was a representation of the god's breath, the jungle's vitality, and the maze's greenery. Jade was used only in the burials of the elite. It covered the Red Queen's chest, wrists, and ears, a clear indication of her influence and possibly even divine favor. The Jadirari mask that was delicately draped over her face was one of the most eerie objects. Unlike Egypt's golden death masks, this one was subtle and was made of dozens of tiny mosaic tiles that were arranged to look like her skull. The ritual purpose of the mask was to portray her as divine in the eyes of the gods, preserve her identity, and protect her soul. Shell artifacts, bone needles, and obsidian blades were scattered close to her bones. These could have represented her status as a priestess, healer, or royal matriarch, or tools for ritual. A single bone pin had a small but deliberate inscription. Her voice's faint echo has vanished into time. Ceramic vessels that had been sealed and likely once held offerings were placed at her feet and around the tomb's perimeter. To keep her alive after death, she could eat, drink, or burn incense. The mayors were of the opinion that the afterlife was a perilous, complex, and difficult journey. These were not luxury items. They were indispensable. The tomb has an intimate, not overcrowded, but intentional modern feel to it. There were only items chosen for their spiritual significance. No gold, no chariots, and no pomp. It was a spiritual roadmap. We are able to get a glimpse of how Mayer viewed death, not as a final event but rather as a power shift, through these treasures. There was no burial for the Red Queen to be forgotten. She was getting ready to go up. The Red Queen left a haunting void despite the splendor of her tomb. Her sarcophagus bore no inscriptions or names. She was not identified by any glyphs on the walls. She was evidently a powerful individual. Who then? Scholars began attempting to connect the dots as soon as her tomb was opened. The most convincing theory is that Zakbu Ar was the wife of Kinich Janab Pal, who is now known as Pal the Great and is the most well-known ruler of Palank. More than just Pal's wife, Zakbu Aha was more. She married into Palank's royal dynasty at a young age and was born into a noble family. She had at least 3 sons, all of whom were of high status, and she was very involved in the ceremony during her husband's time in power. She was the only person who deserved to be buried with such respect. The location of the tomb, just a few feet away from Pal's own grand burial in the Temple of the Inscriptions, bolstered this theory. The close proximity suggests that they were chosen to be together, husband and wife, rulers even after death. The cinnabar is the next thing. In Palank, only 2 burials were discovered with such extensive cinnabar coverage: the Red Queen and Pal. This is unlikely to have happened by chance. However, the mystery intensifies here. In the hope of establishing a connection, both sets of remains underwent DNA testing. But the findings are inconclusive. The woman's bones did not show any maternal resemblance to Pal. However, that did not rule out a relationship with a spouse. After all, you don't have to share blood to get married. She may have been Sakuk, Palank's powerful mother who ruled before he was born, according to some. She might have been a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has been lost to history, according to other theories. Still, the evidence strongly suggests Taku Ao, Pal's spiritual counterpart, mother of kings and queen by title. It's possible that the absence of a name was not a mistake. Could have been done with purpose. In Maya cosmology, the soul lived on through ritual, symbol, and the earth's whispers rather than monuments. Therefore, the Red Queen lingers somewhere in the middle of myth and reality. A woman who ruled was remembered in scarlet and silence rather than in stone. We must comprehend her origins in order to comprehend the Red Queen. A world in which Maya women, particularly royal ones, had more power than most people realize. Politics was frequently a family affair in the Maya civilization. Royal women were more than just co-conspirators. They served as power brokers, priestesses, and diplomats. They sponsored temples, carried out rituals, and were crucial to the legitimacy of the dynasty. Political capital was derived from their bloodlines in order to forge alliances and assert their claims to the throne. Take, for instance, Sakuk, Pal the Great's mother. She assumed power herself when Palank's throne became vacant, serving as queen regent until her son reached adulthood. She was not a substitute. She issued orders and managed construction projects as if she were her own ruler. Pal may never have risen at all without her. She was also not a one-off. Inscriptions from all over the Maya world, including Yakilon, Nanjo, and Calakmul, depict women performing important ceremonies, engaging in warfare diplomacy, and occasionally ruling completely. They were frequently depicted in murals and steel, often standing alongside or even above kings in elaborate headdresses and regalia. Glyphs were used to carve their words. Until they were forgotten, their names were remembered. A lot of that memory had faded by the time the Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later. Native women were viewed through the colonial lens as silent figures in a world dominated by men. However, the archaeology reveals a different narrative, one of complicated gender roles in which power was negotiated rather than simply passed down. The Red Queen is seen in a new light in this context. Although her burial was lavish, sacred, and positioned next to Pal, it suggests that she was a central pillar of the royal order, even though she did not officially rule. Her jade mask was more than just an ornament. It was a representation of one's identity as well as of power that could exist both in life and after death. It's possible that her bloodline was the very thing that held Palanca's dynasty together. A queen was more than just a queen in the Maya civilization. She was a voice in ceremonies, a keeper of sacred lineage, and frequently the intermediary between gods and humans. Even though the Red Queen lacked a name, she never lacked a voice in her world. The Red Queen was buried with more than just riches. She was buried beneath Maya cosmology, ritual symbolism, and intentional design-rich architecture. Her tomb was more than just a grave. It opened the door to eternity. One of Palank's smaller pyramids, Temple Third, was where her body was discovered. However, its proximity to Pal the Great's final resting place, the Temple of the Inscriptions, is instructive. These temples were not constructed haphazardly. Astrology, myth, and dynastic tradition guided their sacred positioning. When compared to its affluent neighbor, Temple the Thief stands modestly. However, it conceals something even more personal: a sealed, unaltered, and perfectly preserved crypt. It was built deep within the core of the temple, only accessible via a steep, narrow staircase. It feels almost like a ritual descent into the underworld, a descent into her tomb. Made of cut stone and tightly sealed for over 130 years, the chamber is stark. The walls are not covered in glyphs or murals. Her story is not told by elaborate carvings. However, it's possible that the silence was chosen. The dead could transform rather than the living could interpret in this space. Her limestone sarcophagus is positioned in the middle like an altar. It echoes Pal's magnificent stone coffin next door. The Red Queen's tomb, on the other hand, has scenes of cosmic rebirth engraved on its lid, which is famous. The body, the cinnabar, and the dying process as a whole take center stage. Nevertheless, there are nebulous architectural cues that provide a glimmer of meaning. The east-to-west orientation of the tomb serves as a metaphor for the path the sun takes from life to death. Although small, the chamber is powerful. It has the impression of being intentional, intimate, and a sacred enclosure for a person who is admired. Maya temples served as bridges between the underworld, the heavens, and the earth for cosmology. To be submerged in one meant to transcend human existence. The eternal home of the Red Queen was not an afterthought. It was a shrine built with care, a place where transformation became death. Her essence is in cinnabar, her bones are in stone, and her legacy is in the building itself. A temple that conveys her importance without words. The ancient Maya believed that death was not the end. It was a threshold, a sacred way to enter Xibalba, the underworld. And this crossing was more than just spiritual for someone like the Red Queen. It was deeply ritualized, political, and cosmological. The purpose of burial ceremonies, which were meticulously planned out and based on myth, was to lead the soul through the perilous depths of the underworld. According to Maya texts and images, Sabala was not a peaceful afterlife. Darkness, bloody rivers, trials, and demon gods all ran through it. The journey could only be completed by those who were spiritually prepared, properly buried, and prepared for ritual. Offerings surrounded the buried Red Queen, which was covered in cinnabar and stone. Everything points to an elite burial. However, there's more. Obsidian blades and bone needles in her tomb point to auto-sacrifice rituals, which may have been reenacted at her burial to empower her spirit, or may have been symbolic tools that represented the rites she had exercised throughout her life. Harari's meticulously constructed jade tile mask was more than just pretty. It could have been a spiritual vessel that kept her face and identity safe as she entered the afterlife. The Maya believed that the soul had to be seen by the gods because the face was a reflection of the soul. She may have been fed in the next world with chocolate, maize, water, or even pulka in the ceramic vessels around her. Stingray spines and shell trumpets, for example, may have been symbols of ritual communication, spiritual instruments, or calls to the gods. Burial wasn't just a way to say goodbye. It was an alteration. The Maya considered death to be the seed, burial to be the planting, and the afterlife to be rebirth. Kings and queens were frequently regarded as God's earthly manifestations. They also went back to their divine beginnings after death. The Red Queen was getting ready to reincarnate as a being connected to the sacred order of the cosmos, rather than as a mortal, covered in the color of blood, encased in a pyramid, and honored with offerings. Her story did not end with her burial. Her legend began at that point. One of Mesoamerica's most well-known tombs can be found just a few steps from the Red Queen's grave. That of Kinich Janab Pal, also called Pal the Great or simply Pal. The artistry, scale, and deeply spiritual symbolism of his burial in the Grand Temple of the Inscriptions make it a popular tourist destination. However, not only is the interior of the Red Queen's tomb extraordinary, but so is its location. Within Temple 3, directly adjacent to Pal's monument, her sarcophagus was concealed. This was no accident in a city like Palenque, where every temple was carefully placed to reflect cosmic principles. It was done with intention, making a firm statement. Many scholars believe that Zakbu Ao, Pal's queen and trusted consort, was the Red Queen. Despite the absence of inscriptions on her tomb, their graves are strikingly similar. Both were treated with extreme reverence and were encased in cinnabar, buried in pyramids, and buried in jade. As if they were two halves of a sacred narrative, these rituals mirror one another. Pal's lid is famous for showing him falling into a tree in the underworld, a cosmic scene of death and rebirth. The pairing itself serves as the source of the symbolism in the Red Queen's simpler tomb, which does not contain such iconography. The Red Queen may have represented the moon, the feminine force that follows its own enigmatic path in the sky, if Pal was the sun traveling through the underworld at night to rise. A cosmic duality was embodied by them both. Order and ritual, male and female, king and queen, sun and moon. Rulership in Maya mythology was not singular. It was interpersonal. Balance was necessary for cosmic harmony. Additionally, that equilibrium extended to the dynastic court. The Maya were preserving not only a marriage but also a cosmic partnership by pairing Pal with the Red Queen. It's possible that their roles in life and death were mirrored in their death. A queen who shares not only a throne but also a legacy alongside her king rather than behind him. They speak without words in their tombs. Through eternity, two souls encased in stone and cinnabar joined together. One of the most sacred silences in history. Even though time forgot her name, the Red Queen of Palenque is remembered as one of the most mysterious and powerful women of ancient times. Her tomb, which has been sealed for over 1,300 years, now whispers across centuries, eliciting inquiries that become increasingly pervasive with each new discovery. She is a mystery that eludes complete comprehension. She may never be identified precisely. Her name was not carved into any glyphs. She had no one to tell her story. Nevertheless, the care that went into her burial, the wealth of her offerings, and the symbolism of her crimson-drenched bones all point to a woman who was really important. Not just as a wife or a consort, but as someone who had real power, spiritual weight, and royal blood. The Red Queen today forces us to reconsider our assumptions. She serves as a reminder that women were not silent in the ancient Maya world. They were in charge of rituals, cities, and dynasties. The Red Queen's reappearance demonstrates that men were not the only ones with power, despite the fact that kings like Pal have long dominated the spotlight. It passed through visionaries, queens, mothers, and priestesses. Her legacy encompasses more than just the things she accumulated. She has started a conversation with archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers about this topic. The temple's architectural choices, every layer of cinnabar, and every jade bead tells us something deliberate. This woman was important, and it's possible that's the most remarkable aspect of her story. Not what we already know, but rather what we still do not. We learn from the Red Queen that history is more than just a collection of facts. It's a living puzzle made up of a shared human desire to connect with the past. In that way, her legacy continues to unfold. Red is the color of life and death, blood and rebirth, and she is wrapped in it. She used to wear a jade mask, but now we can see her face through science, art, and wonder. She retains her name but retains her voice. Unknown but not forgotten. In life, the Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom, but in death, she rules our imagination. Stone was used to close her tomb. In silence, her story was written. She still speaks in some way. On July 6, 1907, Frida Kahlo was born in the lively neighborhood of Coyoacán, which was then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. The Casa Azul, or Blue House, where she grew up, was full of color, contradiction, and quiet strength. It would later serve as a sanctuary, a battlefield, and a museum for one of the 20th century's most famous artists. Frida was the third of four daughters that Guillermo Carlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderon, an ardent Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent, gave birth to. She had opposite parents. Guillermo, intellectual and reserved. Matilda is emotionally distant and religious. Frida would inherit her mother's fierce tenacity, as well as her father's introspection and artistic eye. Frida was imaginative, outspoken, and courageous as a child. She read a lot and asked questions that most adults wouldn't answer. However, she contracted polio at the age of 6, making her right leg weaker and thinner than the other. She tried to hide her physical difference by wearing long skirts, but she never let it stop her spirit. She spent months in bed and was cut off from other children because of the illness. She became more close to her father during this time, who encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and keep her mind sharp. Frida, unlike most girls her age, didn't want to be a housewife or a wife. She enrolled in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City at the age of 15, one of only a few girls accepted, with the intention of becoming a doctor. She stood out not only because of her intelligence, but also because of her rebellious wit, radical thinking, and distinctive style. She joined the Cachuchas, a group of young intellectuals who debated politics, literature, and philosophy. Frida was drawn to ideas that broke with tradition and revolution. But Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world even in those early years, before the bus crash that would define her body and before the fame that would define her legacy. She had sharp edges, unapologetic ideas, and an identity that was too big to fit into anyone else's expectations. She didn't just spend her childhood in Coyoacán. She was getting ready to completely reinvent herself. Frida Kahlo's life was split in two on September 17, 1925. The woman she was made to be and the girl she had been after school that afternoon, she and her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Aris, got on a wooden bus. They were probably arguing as well as laughing and making fun of each other. Frida never took a back seat, but the bus collided with a streetcar just a few seconds later, and in a split second, her future turned into pain, metal, and silence. The accident was horrible. The bus was crushed against a wall by the streetcar, splintering the wood and throwing passengers. A handrail made of iron impaled Frida. It went through her pelvis and entered her left hip. There were 3 fractures in her spinal column. She broke her right leg. Her foot broke off. Her ribs and collarbone were broken. Her shoulder was out of joint. Piercings were in her abdomen. She only had 18 years of age. A borrowed overcoat was used by the man to cover her. Her body sparkled, not from blood but from the gold powder she was carrying in a pouch, according to another observer. Her broken body was covered in what appeared to be glittering ash after it had exploded upon impact. Over the following months, Frida underwent a number of surgeries at the Red Cross Hospital. She writhed with infection and uncertainty for weeks while lying flat on her back in a body cast. With each passing day, the future she had envisioned, one in which she worked as a doctor, grew further away. But something started to move in that stillness. She was given brushes by her father. A special easel was rigged by her mother to hang above her bed. She could see herself in the canopy, which had a mirror on it. Frida then began painting while she was in agony and covered in plaster, both out of boredom and obsession. As she was all she had, her first subjects were her own reflection. But what did not come out was vanity. It was about survival. She had been physically hurt in the crash, but it had also given her access to her own mind and body, as well as the surreal language of pain and identity that would become her art. The girl who wanted to help other people started healing herself, brush stroke by brush stroke. She began painting Frida Kahlo as she lay in steel and plaster, her body fighting for every breath. What started out as therapy soon developed into a language. Furthermore, the purpose of that language was to be deeply personal, brutally honest, and frequently difficult to examine. Frida did not paint pretty landscapes or flowers. She depicted her own physical, emotional, and existential pain in her paintings. Not because she was arrogant, but rather because, as she famously stated, "I paint myself because I'm so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Her first subjects were self-portraits, inspired by Mexican retos, which are devotional paintings that are meant to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Her early works were small in scale and were painted on tin or wood panels. Frida internalized this custom. She used her body as a canvas. The altar of her emotions became her. She painted herself as bleeding, split, and pierced. She is impaled by nails like a modern martyr in one painting. In another, a broken column serves as a metaphor for her shattered spine as she floats in a barren landscape. She painted herself weeping, broken, naked, and decapitated, but she was never inactive. Rather, she was always watching. Her suffering was not exonerated. Beauty, bravery, and even humor permeated her portrayal of trauma's ugliness. In a world that frequently attempted to define her, each piece was a reclamation of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman. However, Frida was not merely recounting her story. She was coming up with a novel visual narrative, one that combines surrealism, medical illustration, Mexican folk art, and symbolism. Color, culture, and myth framed her paintings into dreamlike autopsies of her soul. Frida had changed from the girl who had always wanted to be a doctor by the time she had recovered enough to walk again, though it was a painful process. She was an artist, and no one had ever seen anything like her work. She had turned the worst thing she had ever experienced into a source of inspiration. Frida Kahlo painted more than just her suffering. By drawing attention to it, she transformed suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. Frida Kahlo met Diego Rivera, the man who would become the most profound and turbulent relationship of her life, when she was just 21 years old, still recovering from her injuries and still painting. He was already Mexico's most famous painter, 20 years older than she was. Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism who was massive in both stature and presence. He was known for his expansive, politically charged frescoes that told the story of the Mexican people. Frida had previously seen his work. She was impressed. However, she now desired his opinion on her work. She brought her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education and asked him bluntly, "Do I have talent?" while he was working behind a scaffold. "Yes, and not just out of kindness," Diego said after taking a single glance. Her unfiltered, raw, and unpretentious voice, full of rage, irony, pain, and beauty, was something unique that he recognized in her. They started a relationship that was just as creative as it was consuming. "I suffered 2 accidents in my life," Frida once stated. "One in which I was struck by a streetcar. Diego was the other." They tied the knot in 1929, a strange combination to outsiders. Diego, massive, unfaithful, and well-known in politics. Frida already uses a cane to walk and is fiercely independent with sharp teeth. Her parents referred to it as an elephant and dove getting married. They shared a passionate but chaotic bond. Diego encouraged her painting development and supported her art. However, he was also constantly unfaithful, even to Cristina, Frida's sister. Frida was devastated, and in response, she had lovers of her own, both men and women, including affairs with Georgia O'Keeffe and painter Leon Trotsky, who were rumored to be having with her. They got divorced in 1939, and a year later, they got married again with different terms. Frida would preserve her independence, her home, her money, and her name this time. Their second marriage was more about creative partnership and mutual understanding rather than traditional love. Diego remained a constant presence in Frida's life despite the hurt and betrayals. He put her to the test. He harmed her, but he also believed in her as an artist, a revolutionary, and a woman who had the potential to reimagine painting. They were legendary, even though they were not peaceful together. Frida Kahlo traveled with Diego Rivera in the 1930s as he completed high-profile mural commissions in San Francisco, Detroit, and New York. She was deeply politically uneasy during these years abroad because she was confronted with American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism. Frida was an admirer of indigenous customs, a committed communist, and a proud Mexican nationalist. Her sense of disillusionment only grew as a result of the opulence she witnessed in the United States, particularly during the time that most of the country was ravaged by the Great Depression. She made fun of the culture's focus on appearances and materialism in letters she wrote home. Mexico's grit, color, and contradictions were missing from her life. Frida began painting quieter, more intimate revolutions on tin and canvas, while Diego painted huge murals on factory walls. Her style was solid, sharp, surreal, emotional, intimate, and emotional. She created some of her most famous self-portraits during this time. Frida painted herself for more than egotism. To get by, she painted herself. Her environment became her identity. She turned inward as her accident, multiple surgeries, an unsuccessful Detroit pregnancy left her body in constant pain. In her portraits, she was bleeding, broken, and exposed. However, her expression was always composed, direct, and unapologetic. Henry Ford Hospital, one of her most powerful works, depicts her crying on a hospital bed surrounded by floating symbols of loss. A fetus, a snail, medical supplies, and a broken pelvis. It was very emotional, graphic, and raw. A canvas that was full of truth. Frida immersed herself in leftist politics once she returned to Mexico. While Leon Trotsky was living in exile, she and Diego welcomed him into their house. Frida wore traditional indigenous clothing, Tijuana dresses, not only for fashion but also as a political and cultural statement. Her beliefs were always reflected in her art. Her work was a reflection of her ideology, body, and identity all at once. Frida depicted the human cost of revolution while Rivera painted murals depicting it. The body in shattered pieces, the mind on fire, and the self that is always looking back at them. She became a painter of resistance as well as of pain during her illness and exile. Frida Kahlo was more than just Diego Rivera's wife when she returned to Mexico in the late 1930s. She had transformed into a force, an artist whose work exuded raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and cultural identity. She had become something completely different. She fully integrated herself once she was back in her home country. In Coyoacán, her Casa Azul evolved into a haven of contrast and color. Yellow trim, bright cobalt walls, garden statues of the Aztecs, and monkeys and parrots flying about freely. Frida's imagination was a living extension of the house. Tradition and rebellion, elegance and earthiness, all blended together in it. Exados, Folk art, revolutionary books, and pre-Columbian artifacts surrounded her here. She painted amid the aroma of copal incense and the sounds of mariachi on the street outside while she wore daring Tawana dresses and wore flowers in her hair. The creative process exploded during this time. Her paintings got more political, more complicated, and more symbolic. It appears as though the two Fridas revealed a split self. One was dressed in European attire with a broken heart, and the other was strong and composed in indigenous attire. It was a portrait of love, loss, and heritage that served as Frida's visual autobiography. She showed her work in Paris in 1939, and she was praised by Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky for her fiercely original style. Frida, on the other hand, stood out from the other surrealists. She resisted André Breton's attempt to classify her as one of their own. She stated, "They thought I was a surrealist. However, I wasn't. I've never drawn dreams. My own reality was painted by me." She painted Mexico, not the romanticized version shown on postcards, but the real, living country she adored. Symbolism pulsated throughout her work. Hearts, skeletons, hummingbirds, corn, thorns, and blood. She exposed the violence of her homeland's past and present while honoring its indigenous roots. However, her health continued to deteriorate even as her artistic voice grew stronger. Chronic pain, multiple surgeries, and infections became daily realities. She propped herself up in bed, her body in corsets, and clenched her fingers around the brush as she painted through it. Frida had gone back to Mexico not to rest, but rather to reclaim her power through painting, politics, and her unflinching embrace of herself. Frida Kahlo's body continued to betray her throughout the 1940s. Her spine was getting worse. Her right leg always had an infection. Over the course of her lifetime, she had more than 30 surgeries, often in grueling succession. She spent months in bed, encased in body casts or immobilized by traction devices that separated her bones. She nonetheless painted. Throughout these years, each canvas became both an act of release and resistance. Her works became darker and more obstinate. She refused to conceal behind metaphor and painted with a clarity sharpened by pain. She appears split in half in the broken column, her body pierced with nails, and her spine is replaced by a cracked ionic column. However, her gaze is unwavering and her face is composed. For Frida, pain was no longer just a topic. It was her foe, her companion, and her inspiration. Also, her political voice got louder. She marched in demonstrations, joined the Mexican Communist Party, wrote vehement letters decrying imperialism and injustice, and so on. She defiantly held signs and yelled slogans at protests in a wheelchair when her health made it impossible for her to walk. Frida got her first solo show in Mexico in 1953, which was a long overdue celebration of her work. However, due to her fragile health, doctors advised her not to attend. As a result, she did what Frida would only do. She was transported in an ambulance, placed in the middle of the gallery on her hospital bed, and brought in on a stretcher. She greeted guests with tequila, laughter, and that fire still burning in her eyes, dressed in traditional garb and surrounded by her own work. Her final works were terrifying and childlike at the same time. She painted herself in a steel corset cradled by Marx, casting away symbols of oppression. In Marxism will give health to the sick. A still life of sliced watermelons was her last work. Viva la Vida, Long Live Life, appears on one piece. She maintained her political, joyful, and defiant demeanor even in the face of death. The final portraits of Frida Kahlo were more than just self-portraits. They were acts of revolution, written with life and pain. Frida Kahlo passed away on July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, in the same location in Coyoacán where she was born, La Casa Azul. Despite the fact that a pulmonary embolism was listed as the official cause, those closest to her whispered of something more sinister. Although she had been ill, She had also been exhausted by surgeries, pain, and the prolonged conflict with her own body. She had been to a political demonstration in Guatemala against the CIA coup just a few days earlier. She insisted on going, her clenched fist in the air, despite being disabled and unable to use a wheelchair. Revolution was her last beating heart, her most recent, brief, and piercing entry in her diary. I hope to never return, and I hope the exit is joyful. The Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most prestigious cultural establishment, was the location of Frida's funeral. Friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries watched over her body as it was draped in the Mexican Communist Party's red flag. Diego Rivera couldn't cry. He referred to her as his greatest love ever, despite the fact that his betrayals nearly broke her. However, in the years that followed her passing, a remarkable event occurred. Frida Kahlo insisted on staying put. Her name was initially only mentioned in art circles. It was difficult to classify her works because they were too political for surrealists and too surreal for traditionalists. However, her image, her narrative, and her defiance began to resonate gradually. Frida's voice grew in prominence during the 1970s and 1980s as feminist scholars and activists reclaimed lost voices. She was no longer just a painter. She was a representation of beauty out of pain, resistance-based feminism, unapologetic Mexican identity, queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. She became famous for her face, unibrow, gaze, and flowers in her hair. Her house turned into a museum. Her paintings are on display in some of the world's most prestigious museums, and her diary became a holy book. The majority of Frida Kahlo's life had been spent in Diego's shadow. She, however, stepped forward in death. She left more than just paintings behind. She made us all dare to look by leaving behind a mirror, with fire, not compassion or apprehension. The image of Frida Kahlo can be found today on everything from t-shirts to murals to dolls to memes to posters to icons. Her direct gaze, her flower-crowned hair, and her distinctive unibrow are all instantly recognizable. But it's not just that people know her face. They also know the truth behind it, which is what makes her legacy so powerful. Frida did not attempt perfection. She was too big for the boxes. She had no interest in being conventional. She gave us authenticity in a world that demands perfection. Realness that is contradictory, messy, vibrant, angry, happy, and raw. She celebrated her unique qualities, her disability, her queerness, her politics, and her culture into works of art that transcended decades and borders. She is now more than just an artist. She is a global symbol of rebellion, feminism, pride in one's culture, and inventive resistance. She is a fearless bisexual icon for the queer community who lived openly and unapologetically during a time when silence was expected. She serves as a reminder for women that power does not require consent. She serves as evidence for disabled artists that pain need not hinder their ability to paint. She is a fierce, folkloric, reclaimed Mexican daughter who will always be a part of the nation's soul. Her paintings, which were once thought to be too strange or personal, are now considered to be among the best in the world. Works like the self-portrait of the two Fridas featuring a hummingbird, thorn necklace, and broken column are more than just seen. Anyone who has ever felt the need to transform their suffering into something sacred can relate to them deeply. She made the marginalized her center of attention. She was open to conflict, a gold-wielding communist, a betrayed woman who rekindled her love, a broken body with an unbreakable soul. She painted with conviction and not just color throughout the entire process. Frida Kahlo did not request to be a symbol. She simply stated the truth about her own situation, and in doing so told the truth to millions of other people, many of whom had never before seen their own reflection in art. We now see bravery when we look at her face. We perceive color. We observe opposition. We see that Frida is still alive and well.